Hi, my name is Abraham. I'm part of MLAT 34, and this is my final project on Serrano versus Priest. We interact with education systems and school environments that often look equal on the surface, but in reality they produce very different outcomes depending on location and income. In California, this issue has a long history tied to school segregation, student activism, and unequal access to resources. One major moment that challenged this system was the East Los Angeles walkouts, where students protested unequal conditions in their schools. This larger history connects directly to legal and structural changes in education funding, especially the case of Serrano versus Priest, which questioned whether school funding based on local property taxes was fundamentally unequal. Before Serrano, public schools in California were largely funded through local property taxes. This meant that wealthier neighborhoods had access to significantly more funding, while lower income communities had fewer resources, larger class sizes, and fewer academic opportunities. The main reason that there were so many issues with this was because if you were part of a wealthy neighborhood, for example, even if you lived in a poorer neighborhood, but you were attending a school that was in a higher income area, this meant that you had access to more educational resources rather than it just being dependent on what you made or what your family made individually. The main issue with this isn't that it's wrong for kids to go to higher income schools to receive better education, but it's more so the fact that they have to do all of that in order to actually get a better academic curriculum. Such as, for example, within the historical context in the past, there was a pattern that revolved around the segregation of schools. So Mexicans and Mexican Americans, they needed to attend Mexican schools, which were put in place to Americanize them. The Americanization would be done through processes such as having to learn how to speak English rather than keep speaking Spanish. There was a condemnation of speaking Spanish in these schools. So what this does, and what the modern example of lower income taxes leading to poorer schooling just continue to show that there is a level of segregation that was embedded in the system that was meant to give people unequal access to education. Which, for further context, that's why the East LA walkouts happened, because of this unequal access to education. The Latinos in the area, and spread it out throughout the nation, began to start fighting back by walking out in the middle of these classes and protesting. These protests were to bring light to that unfair educational standard that was set in place. In the case of Serrano versus Priest, this was an instance in which the educational system recognized these inequalities. As in 1971, after the 1968 East LA walkouts, they continued to recognize that there were educational inequalities that the Latino community faced. As John Serrano Jr., he was the father of two students attending an elementary school in East Los Angeles. He was called in by one of the principals of one of the elementary schools in which his two kids were performing well, and the principal told him, quote, "You've got a couple of very bright kids. Get them out of East LA schools if you want to give them a chance." This shows us that the educational curriculum was still not up to par, and the staff was well aware of this. So it's not a matter of whether the principal thought that this was right, but it's more that the principal recognized we cannot give them the education that they deserve. So what Serrano was looking to complete with Serrano versus Priest, it was to combat that local property tax was unconstitutional and that it was a form of wealth discrimination. With this lawsuit, the court recognized that the wealth of a community should not determine the quality of a child's education. This was a major legal shift because it acknowledged the structural funding systems themselves can create inequality even without intentional discrimination. However, even though Serrano aimed to reduce inequality, it did not completely eliminate the differences in school funding that exist within districts. The system changed legally, but the underlying disparities continued in new forms. A major development that complicated this issue further was Proposition 13. Prop 13 limited property tax revenue, which significantly reduced stable funding for public services, including schools. While it was designed to control rising taxes, it also made school funding more dependent on local conditions and state-level redistribution. This created long-term effects where schools still experience unequal access to resources. Even beyond official funding formulas, inequality continues through other channels. For example, living in a wealthier community is still going to have its benefits, as it means that there is more than likely going to be more disposable income that families will have. The role that this disposable income plays long-term within school districts is that a wealthier school district will be able to share and give more money to fundraisers for the schools. So in turn, this extra money that can be raised allows for the school to either hire more teachers, get more supplies. There's just more money to be made within schools that have that extra disposable income versus living in a poorer area, such as, for example, let's say West Oakland. There are a lot of people who are getting by paycheck to paycheck and trying to just make a living and sending their kids to the most local public school that they can afford to commute to consistently, in comparison to living in an area like Piedmont, which is about 10 to 15 minutes away at most, and you have a totally different experience for students within that school and district. So even when funding is structuralized and made to work in a more quote-unquote fair way overall, there are still other issues that go hand in hand with poorer school conditions. Just because Prop 13 changed the way that schools are funded that isn't strictly through local property tax, that doesn't mean that it solved the issue that John Serrano was actually proposing to begin with. And what this shows us is that the educational discrepancies that we are seeing in modern day capitalist environments, they're not by accident, but it is an ongoing structure and system that is set in place to hold back poorer communities. And even though there are technical wins, such as through winning the court case, which was Serrano versus Priest, and with changes after the East LA walkouts, these issues still haven't been fully solved due to the way that there is still some form of wealth discrimination that is happening on a deeper, more local level rather than it being at a state level, which was shown through the local property tax example that John Serrano was fighting for. And on a further scale, there's also the issue with the current administration, for example, the Trump administration, being anti-immigrant and pushing against immigrant rights, so taking away their educational opportunities, for example. For immigrants and Mexicans and people from any part of Latin America, is when you have claims that are being made that if people from these countries in Mexico or Central America begin to come in, they're going to commit these crimes. And by dehumanizing people this way, they are able to easily persuade the public to not allow for better educational or more educational opportunities for these groups, because they don't want to get into any issues or have people who will quote unquote commit crimes be integrated into their society. So the question going forward is, how can you teach this group of people that have these beliefs that were given to them by a group that doesn't want to see immigrants gain any status within the country? How can you convince them that we are not that way? And that just makes everything a lot harder when you continue having these groups and entities supporting these false claims about large groups of people and dehumanizing them in order to avoid integration into society for them. And with that, that will be my final project. Thank you for all the time.